The sitting is open. The court meets this morning to hear the State of Israel present its single round of oral argument on the request for the indication of provisional measures submitted by the Republic of South Africa on 29 December 2023 in the case concerning application of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide in the Gaza Strip, South Africa versus Israel. I shall now give the floor to the co-agent of Israel, Mr. Tal Becker. You have the floor, Excellency.
Madam President, distinguished members of the Court, it is an honor to appear before you again on behalf of the State of Israel. The State of Israel is singularly aware of why the Genocide Convention, which has been invoked in these proceedings, was adopted. Seared in our collective memory is the systematic murder of 6 million Jews as part of a premeditated and heinous program for their total annihilation. Given the Jewish people's history and its foundational texts, it is not surprising that Israel was among the first states to ratify the Genocide Convention without reservation and to incorporate its provisions in its domestic legislation. For some, the promise of never again for all peoples is a slogan. For Israel, it is the highest moral obligation. Raphael Lemkin, a Polish Jew who witnessed the unspeakable horrors of the Holocaust, is credited with coining the term genocide. He helped the world recognize that the existing legal lexicon was simply inadequate to capture the devastating evil that the Nazi Holocaust unleashed. The applicant has now sought to invoke this term in the context of Israel's conduct in a war it did not start and did not want. A war in which Israel is defending itself against Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and other terrorist organizations whose brutality knows no bounds. The civilian suffering in this war, like in all wars, is tragic. It is heartbreaking. The harsh realities of the current hostilities are made especially agonizing for civilians, given Hamas's reprehensible strategy of seeking to maximize civilian harm to both Israelis and Palestinians, even as Israel seeks to minimize it. But as this court has already made clear, the Genocide Convention was not designed to address the brutal impact of intensive hostilities on the civilian population, even when the use of force raises, quote, very serious issues of international law and involves enormous suffering and continuing loss of life, end quote. The convention was set apart to address a malevolent crime of the most exceptional severity. We live at a time when words are cheap. In an age of social media and identity politics, the temptation to reach for the most outrageous term, to vilify and demonize, has become for many irresistible. But if there is a place where words should still matter, where truth should still matter, it is surely a court of law. The applicant has regrettably put before the court a profoundly distorted factual and legal picture. The entirety of its case hinges on a deliberately curated, decontextualized, and manipulative description of the reality of current hostilities. South Africa purports to come to this court in the lofty position of a guardian of the interest of humanity. But in delegitimizing Israel's 75-year existence in its opening presentation yesterday, that broad commitment to humanity rang hollow. And in its sweeping counterfactual description of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it seemed to erase both Jewish history and any Palestinian agency or responsibility. Indeed, the delegitimization of Israel, since its very establishment in 1948 in the applicant's submissions, sounded barely distinguishable from Hamas's own rejectionist rhetoric. It is unsurprising, therefore, that in the applicant's telling, both Hamas's responsibility for the situation in Gaza and the very humanity of its Israeli victims are removed from view. The attempt to weaponize the term genocide against Israel in the present context does more than tell the court a grossly distorted story. And it does more than empty the word of its unique force and special meaning. It subverts the object and purpose of the convention itself, with ramifications for all states seeking to defend themselves against those who demonstrate total disdain for life and for the law. Madam President, members of the court, On Saturday, October 7th, a Jewish religious holiday, thousands of Hamas and other militants breached Israeli sovereign territory by sea, land, and air, invading over 20 Israeli communities, bases, and the site of a music festival. What proceeded, under the cover of thousands of rockets fired indiscriminately into Israel, was the wholesale massacre, mutilation, rape, and abduction of as many citizens as the terrorists could find before Israel's forces repelled them. Openly displaying elation, they tortured children in front of parents and parents in front of children, burned people, including infants, alive, and systematically raped and mutilated scores of women, men, and children. All told, some 1,200 people were butchered that day, more than 5,500 maimed, and some 240 hostages abducted, including infants, entire families, persons with disabilities, and Holocaust survivors, some of whom have since been executed, many of whom have been tortured, sexually abused, and starved in captivity. Representatives of the hostages' families are in this courtroom today, and we acknowledge their presence and their boundless suffering. We know of the brutality of October 7th, not only from the harrowing testimonies of the survivors, the unmistakable proof of carnage and sadism left behind, and the forensic evidence taken at the scene. We know it because the assailants proudly filmed and broadcast their barbarism. The events of that day are all but ignored in the applicant's submissions, but we are compelled to share with the court some fraction of its horror. The largest calculated mass murder of Jews in a single day since the Holocaust. We do so not because these acts, however sadistic and systematic, release Israel of its obligations to uphold the law as it defends its citizens and territory. That is unquestionable. We do so because it is impossible to understand the armed conflict in Gaza without appreciating the nature of the threat that Israel is facing and the brutality and lawlessness of the armed force confronting it. In the volume of materials submitted to members of the court, access has been provided to a portion of the raw footage for separate screening. But I am obliged to put before the court today some small fragment of the scenes of unfathomable cruelty that took place in hundreds of locations on that horrible day. Johnny Simantov, a wheat farmer, and his wife Tamar, an activist for women's rights, lived in kibbutz Nir Oz. When the rocket fire started, they hid in the safe room with their 4-year-old son Omer and their 6-year-old twins Arbel and Shachar. During their rampage, Hamas militants set fire to their house. Johnny texted his sister Renee, "They're here, they're burning us, we're suffocating." The whole family was burned alive, to ashes, making DNA identification especially difficult. A survivor of the Nova Music Festival massacre testified to police to witnessing a Hamas militant brutally raping a young woman, as another militant cut off her breast and toyed with it. A second militant then raped her again, shooting her in the head while still inside her. In one video recorded by a home surveillance system, a Hamas militant throws a grenade into a safe room where a father and his 2 sons have rushed to hide. The father is killed, the 2 sons are injured and bleeding as a militant pulls them into the living room. One child can be heard screaming to his brother, "Why am I alive? I can't see anything. They're going to kill us." The militant casually opens the fridge, takes out a bottle, and drinks. And then there is this recording from kibbutz Mefalsim. As stated, none of these atrocities absolve Israel of its obligations under the law. But they do enable the court to appreciate 3 core aspects of the present proceedings, which the applicant has obscured from view. First, that if there have been acts that may be characterized as genocidal, then they have been perpetrated against Israel. If there is a concern about the obligations of states under the Genocide Convention, then it is in relation to their responsibilities to act against Hamas's proudly declared agenda of annihilation, which is not a secret and is not in doubt. The annihilationist language of Hamas's charter is repeated regularly by its leaders, with the goal, in the words of one member of Hamas's political bureau, of the cleansing of Palestine of the filth of the Jews. It is expressed no less chillingly in the words of senior Hamas member Razi Hamad to Lebanese television on October 24th, 2023, who refers to the October 7th attacks, what Hamas calls the Al-Aqsa flood, as follows.
احنا الدولة لابد ان نزيلها، لانه بالفعل هي تعتبر كارثة أمنية وعسكرية وسياسية للأمة العربية والإسلامية، يجب أن تنتهي. لذلك احنا لا نخجل من نقول ذلك بكل قوة، إنه إسرائيل لازم نقدمها، وحنقدمها مرة ثانية وثالثة، ومش هذا حتكون طوفان الأقصى أول مرة، لا حتكون ثانية وثالثة ورابعة.
In the continuation of this interview, Hamad is asked, does that mean the annihilation of Israel? Yes, of course, he says. The existence of Israel is illogical. And then he says, nobody should blame us for the things we do. On October 7th, October 10th, October 1 millionth, everything we do is justified. End quote. Given that on October 7th, before any military response by Israel, South Africa issued an official statement blaming Israel for, quote, the recent conflagration, essentially blaming Israel for the murder of its own citizens. One wonders whether the applicant agrees. Second, it is in response to the slaughter of October 7th, which Hamas openly vows to repeat, and to the ongoing attacks against it from Gaza, that Israel has the inherent right to take all legitimate measures to defend its citizens and secure the release of the hostages. This right is also not in doubt. It has been acknowledged by states across the world. Astonishingly, the court has been requested to indicate a provisional measure calling on Israel to suspend its military operations. But this amounts to an attempt to deny Israel its ability to meet its obligations to the defense of its citizens, to the hostages, and to over 110,000 internally displaced Israelis unable to safely return to their homes. The applicant in its submissions to the court makes almost no mention of the ongoing humanitarian suffering of Israel's citizens at the hands of Hamas, and treats the hostages still held in captivity as barely an afterthought. But is there a reason these people on your screen are unworthy of protection? Hamas is not a party to these proceedings. The applicant, by its request, seeks to thwart Israel's inherent right to defend itself, to let Hamas not just get away with its murder, literally, but render Israel defenseless as Hamas continues to commit it. Yesterday, counsel for the applicant made the astonishing claim that Israel was denied this right, and as a matter of fact should not be able to protect itself from Hamas's attacks. But allow me to draw attention to these words written by Professor Vaughan Lowe. Quote, the source of the attack, whether a state or non-state actor, is irrelevant to the existence of the right to defense. Force may be used to avert a threat because no one and no state is obliged by law passively to suffer the delivery of an attack. Israel agrees with these words, as I suspect would any sovereign state. If the claim of the applicant now is that in the armed conflict between Israel and Hamas, Israel must be denied the ability to defend its citizens, then the absurd upshot of South Africa's argument is this. Under the guise of the allegation against Israel of genocide, this court is asked to call for an end to operations against the ongoing attacks of an organization that pursues an actual genocidal agenda, an organization that has violated every past ceasefire and used it to rearm and plan new atrocities, an organization that declares its unequivocal resolve to advance its genocidal plans. That is an unconscionable request, and it is respectfully submitted that it cannot stand. Third, the court is informed of the events of October 7th because if there are any provisional measures that should appropriately be indicated here, they are indeed with respect to South Africa. It is a matter of public record that South Africa enjoys close relations with Hamas, despite its formal recognition as a terrorist organization by numerous states across the world. These relations have continued unabated even after the October 7th atrocities. South Africa has long hosted and celebrated its ties with Hamas figures, including a senior Hamas delegation that, incredibly, visited the country for a, quote, solidarity gathering just weeks after the massacre. In justifying instituting proceedings, South Africa makes much of its obligations under the Genocide Convention. It seems fitting then that it be instructed to comply with those obligations itself, to end its own language of delegitimization of Israel's existence, end its support for Hamas, and use its influence with this organization so that Hamas permanently ends its campaign of genocidal terror and releases the hostages. Madam President, members of the court, the hostilities between Israel and Hamas have exacted a terrible toll on both Israelis and Palestinians. But any genuine effort to understand the cause of this toll must take account of the horrendous reality created by Hamas within the Gaza Strip. When Israel withdrew all its soldiers and civilians from Gaza in 2005, it left a coastal area with the potential to become a political and economic success story. Hamas's violent takeover in 2007 changed all that. Over the past 16 years of its rule, Hamas has smuggled countless weapons into Gaza and has diverted billions in international aid, not to build schools, hospitals, or shelters to protect its population from the dangers of the attacks it launched against Israel over many years, but rather to turn massive swaths of the civilian infrastructure into perhaps the most sophisticated terrorist stronghold in the history of urban warfare. Remarkably, counsel for the applicant described the suffering in Gaza as unparalleled and unprecedented, as if they are unaware of the utter devastation wrought in wars that have raged just in recent years around the world. Sadly, the civilian suffering in warfare is not unique to Gaza. What is actually unparalleled and unprecedented is the degree to which Hamas has entrenched itself within the civilian population and made Palestinian civilian suffering an integral part of its strategy. Hamas has systematically and unlawfully embedded its military operations, militants and assets throughout Gaza, within and beneath densely populated civilian areas. It has built an extensive warren of underground tunnels for its leaders and fighters, several hundred miles in length, throughout the Strip, with thousands of access points and terrorist hubs located in homes, mosques, UN facilities, schools, and perhaps most shockingly, hospitals. This is not an occasional tactic. It is an integrated, pre-planned, extensive, and abhorrent method of warfare, purposely and methodically murdering civilians, firing rockets indiscriminately, systematically using civilians, sensitive sites, and civilian objects as shields, stealing and hoarding humanitarian supplies, allowing those under its control to suffer so that it can fuel its fighters and terrorist campaign. The appalling suffering of civilians, both Israeli and Palestinian, is first and foremost the result of this despicable strategy. The horrible cost of Hamas not only failing to protect its civilians, but actively sacrificing them for its own propaganda and military benefit. And if Hamas abandons this strategy, releases the hostages, lays down its arms, the hostilities and suffering would end. Madam President, members of the court, there are many distortions in the applicant's submission to the court, but as shall be demonstrated by counsel, there is one that overshadows them all. In the applicant's telling, it is almost as if there is no intensive armed conflict taking place between two parties at all. No grave threat to Israel and its citizens, only an Israeli assault on Gaza. The court is told of widespread damage to buildings, but it is not told, for example, how many thousands of those buildings were destroyed because they were booby-trapped by Hamas, how many became legitimate targets because of the strategy of using civilian objects and protected sites for military purposes, how many buildings were struck by over 2,000 indiscriminate terrorist rockets that misfired and landed in Gaza itself. The court is told of over 23,000 casualties, as the applicant repeats, as many have, unverified statistics provided by Hamas itself, hardly a reliable source. Every civilian casualty in this conflict is a human tragedy that demands our compassion. But the court is not told how many thousands of casualties are in fact militants, how many were killed by Hamas fire, how many were civilians taking direct part in hostilities, and just how many are the result of legitimate and proportionate use of force against military targets, even if tragic. And the court is also told of the dire humanitarian situation in Gaza, but it is not told of Hamas's practice of stealing and hoarding aid. It is not told of the extensive Israeli efforts to mitigate civilian harm, of the humanitarian initiatives being undertaken to enable the flow of supplies and provide medical attention to the wounded. The applicant purports to describe the reality in Gaza, but it is as if Hamas and its total contempt for civilian life just do not exist as a direct cause of that reality. Hamas is widely estimated to have over 30,000 fighters and is known to bring minors no older than 15 or 16 into its ranks. They are coming for us. But in South Africa's telling, they have all but disappeared. There are no explosives in mosques and schools and children's bedrooms, no ambulances used to transport fighters, no tunnels and terrorist hubs under sensitive sites, no fighters dressed as civilians, no commandeering of aid trucks, no firing from civilian homes, UN facilities, and even safe zones. There is only Israel acting in Gaza. The applicant is essentially asking the court to substitute the lens of armed conflict between a state and a lawless terrorist organization with the lens of a so-called genocide of a state against a civilian population. But it is not offering the court a lens. It is offering it a blindfold. Madam President, members of the court, the nightmarish environment created by Hamas has been concealed by the applicant, but it is the environment in which Israel is compelled to operate. Israel is committed, as it must be, to comply with the law, but it does so in the face of Hamas's utter contempt for the law. It is committed, as it must be, to demonstrate humanity, but it does so in the face of Hamas's utter inhumanity. As will be presented by Council, these commitments are a matter of express government policy, military directives and procedures. They are also an expression of Israel's core values. And, as shall also be shown, they are matched by genuine measures on the ground to mitigate civilian harm under the unprecedented and excruciating conditions of warfare created by Hamas. It is plainly inconceivable, under the terms set by this very court, that a state conducting itself in this way, in these circumstances, may be said to be engaged in genocide, not even prima facie. The key component of genocide, the intention to destroy a people in whole or in part, is totally lacking. What Israel seeks operating in Gaza is not to destroy a people, but to protect a people, its people, who are under attack on multiple fronts, and to do so in accordance with the law, even as it faces a heartless enemy determined to use that very commitment against it. As will be detailed by Council, Israel's lawful aims in Gaza have been clearly and repeatedly articulated by its Prime Minister, its Defence Minister, and all members of the War Cabinet. As the Prime Minister reiterated yet again this week, Israel is fighting Hamas terrorists, not the civilian population. Israel aims to ensure that Gaza can never again be used as a launchpad for terrorism. As the Prime Minister reaffirms, Israel seeks neither to permanently occupy Gaza or to displace its civilian population. It wants to create a better future for Israelis and Palestinians alike, where both can live in peace, thrive and prosper, and where the Palestinian people have all the power to govern themselves, but not the capacity to threaten Israel. If there is a threat to that vision, if there is a humanitarian threat to the Palestinian civilians of Gaza, it stems primarily from the fact that they have lived under the control of a genocidal terrorist organization that has total disregard for their life and well-being. That organization, Hamas, and its sponsors seek to deny Israel, Palestinians, and Arab states across the region the ability to advance a common future of peace, coexistence, security, and prosperity. Israel is in a war of defense against Hamas, not against the Palestinian people, to ensure that they do not succeed. In these circumstances, there can hardly be a charge more false and more malevolent than the allegation against Israel of genocide. The applicant has regrettably engaged in a transparent attempt to abuse the Convention's compulsory jurisdiction mechanism, and in particular, the provisional measures phase of proceedings to bring under the purview of the court matters over which, in truth, it lacks jurisdiction. Madam President, members of the court, the Genocide Convention was a solemn promise made to the Jewish people and to all peoples of never again. The applicant, in effect, invites the court to betray that promise. If the term genocide can be so diminished in the way that it advocates, if provisional measures can be triggered in the way that it suggests, the convention becomes an aggressor's charter. It will reward, indeed encourage, the terrorists who hide behind civilians at the expense of the states seeking to defend against them. To maintain the integrity of the Genocide Convention, to maintain its promise and the court's own role as its guardian, it is respectfully submitted that the application and request should be dismissed for what they are, a libel, designed to deny Israel the right to defend itself according to the law from the unprecedented terrorist onslaught it continues to face, and to free the 136 hostages Hamas still holds. I thank you for your kind attention. May I ask, Madam President, that you call Professor Shaw to the podium.
I thank the co-agent of Israel for his statement, and I now invite Professor Malcolm Shaw to take the floor. You have the floor, Professor Shaw.
All right, guys, let me tell you about Field of Greens. I love this stuff. It is a powder made from dehydrated whole fruits and vegetables that are carefully selected to give you the most nutrients in your diet possible. You just take a scoop of this powder, mix it into your ice water, your iced tea. It actually tastes really delicious. It's an easy way to get all of your fruits and vegetables into your diet. I personally really like the lemon lime flavor, but they have other flavors. They also have a really great product on their site called Lean, and these are some pills that you take that are really high quality. They don't give you any of the jitters, but they help boost your metabolism. They help give you some energy, and they suppress your appetite, and those are really great as well. They have really high quality products at Brickhouse Nutrition. So definitely head to their website, fieldofgreens.com, browse around, check out all the products, pick what you like, and then use the promo code Kim and get 15% off your first order. Again, that's fieldofgreens.com. Use the promo code Kim to get 15% off your first order.
South Africa casts its net widely. In its application, it uses the word context many times. In particular, it declares that it is important to place the acts of genocide in the broader context of Israel's conduct towards the Palestinians during its 75-year-long apartheid. Leaving aside the outrageous nature of that statement, why stop at 75 years? Why not refer to 1922 and the approval by the Council of the League of Nations of the British Mandate? Or 1917, the proclamation of the Balfour Declaration? Maybe also include the entry into the land of Israel of the Israelite tribes some 3,500 years ago. No. The immediate and proximate context for the specific allegations of genocide claimed by South Africa lies in the events of the 7th of October, when Hamas militants and other armed groups and individuals stormed into the internationally recognized sovereign territory of Israel and committed acts of barely credible atrocity. It was these events that truly constitute the real context for South Africa's allegations. Indeed, such acts may be seen as the real genocide in this situation. Article 9 of the Genocide Convention, to which both states are parties without reservation, makes the court's jurisdiction conditional on the existence of a dispute relating to the interpretation, application, or fulfillment of the convention. And the relevant date for determining the existence of such a dispute is the date on which the application is submitted to the court. South Africa cites no relevant exchange between the parties, which would be the normal fashion for the expression and determination of a dispute between states. This actually typifies how South Africa has approached this matter. It seems to believe that it does not take two to tango. It is sufficient if one state determines there is a dispute, leaving the other party flummoxed. South Africa decided unilaterally that a dispute existed, irrespective of Israel's conciliatory and friendly response since repeated. Perhaps had South Africa taken up this offer, at the time proffered as a result of its own note, the parties may have decided there was no dispute as such to place before the court under the Genocide Convention. and that South Africa's expressed concerns over the genocide allegation would have been assuaged. We may never know. South Africa's precipitate institution of proceedings foreclosed that option. South Africa accepts the need to demonstrate intent. It referred to the concept of specific intent in its application, both generally and in the specific context of its discussion of the court's prima facie jurisdiction in provisional measures proceedings. Indeed, South Africa placed a considerable emphasis upon intent in its pleadings yesterday by Ms. Hassim. Mr. Kaitobi devoted his whole pleading to this requirement. As far as the acts are concerned in this case, there is little beyond random assertions to demonstrate that Israel has or has had the specific intent to destroy, in whole or in part, the Palestinian people as such. The intention, faced with the 7th of October atrocities and the continuing rocket fire and incarceration of the hostages on the part of Israel to act in order to defend itself so as to terminate the threats against it and rescue the hostages, certainly exists. The intent to deal with the armed militants of Hamas and other such groups is undeniable. Were it the case, which we deny, that Israeli forces have transgressed some of the rules of conflict, then the matter would be tackled at the appropriate time by Israel's robust and independent legal system. But that is not the intent to destroy all or part of a people as such. Israel's actions in restricting its targeting practices to attack military personnel or objectives in accordance with international humanitarian law in a proportionate manner in each case, as well as its practice of mitigating civilian harm, such as by forewarning civilians of impending action by the unprecedented and extensive use of telephone calls, leafleting, and so forth, coupled with the facilitation of humanitarian assistance, all demonstrate the precise opposite of any possible genocidal intent. South Africa, in seeking to discover the necessary intent, presents a distorted picture. It misunderstands the nature and provenance of certain comments made by some Israeli politicians. Let me try and explain the big picture. Israel possesses a clear and effective structure of authority with regard to governmental decision. The war against Hamas is managed on behalf of the government by two central organs: the Ministerial Committee on National Security Affairs and the War, and the War Cabinet, the latter established for the purpose of managing the war by the former. These bodies make the relevant decisions regarding the war's conduct, and according to Israeli law, the decisions of the government and its committees obligate the ministers of the government in accordance with the principle of collective responsibility. It is the collective decisions of these bodies which are the binding provisions in question. The Prime Minister stands at the head of these organs, decides on the agenda of their meetings, steers their activity, and summarises the meetings and the instructions issued therein. To make it clear, in order to determine the policy and intentions of the government of Israel, it is necessary to examine the decisions of the Ministerial Committee on National Security Affairs and the War Cabinet, and to examine whether the particular comments expressed conform or not with the policies and decisions made. Thus, to produce random quotes that are not in conformity with government policy, produced as describing, is misleading at best. Such as the statement by the Minister of Heritage, for example, who is completely outside the policy and decision-making process in the war. In any event, his statement was immediately repudiated by members of the War Cabinet and other ministers, including the Prime Minister. In tab 1A of the volume which Israel has submitted to the court, one may find numerous excerpts from internal cabinet decisions that attest to Israel's true intent throughout this war. For example, one finds the instructions from the Prime Minister in a meeting of the Ministerial Committee on National Security Affairs from the 29th of October, stating the following. 1. The Prime Minister stated time and again, we must prevent a humanitarian disaster. 2. The Prime Minister indicated the possible sorts of solutions that will ensure required supply of water, food and medicine, increasing the amount of trucks entering with the necessary inspections. 3, promoting the construction of field hospitals in the south of the Gaza Strip. To re-emphasise, this is a directive to authorities, nothing less. Tab 1A contains a considerable number of similar directives, emphasising the need to avoid harm to civilians and facilitate humanitarian aid. Genocidal intent? Let me turn to the IDF. This, like every army, is a hierarchical body that operates by way of orders from superiors and is headed by the Chief of the General Staff. Remarks or actions of a soldier do not and cannot reflect policy. In tab 1B, one may find a daily operational directive, which I understand is repeated day by day, issued by the Operations Directorate of the IDF, stating that attacks will be solely directed towards military targets while adhering to the principles of distinction, proportionality, and the obligation taking precautions in attacks in order to reduce collateral damage. This is a directive that binds all IDF forces. It continues by stating that the laws of armed conflict allow destruction to civilian property only when there is a military necessity to do so, and prohibit harm to property for deterrence purposes only, or for the purpose of punishment, individual or collective. It emphasises that it is necessary to treat enemy civilians with respect. They should not be treated in a humiliating manner, and civilians should not be used for the purpose of performing activities that might put them under risk to their life or their body. This is a mandatory instruction, effective since the start of the war. Tab 1B contains many similar provisions, which are themselves only an illustration of many other such directives, orders and procedures. Further, on the 28th of October, the Prime Minister publicly declared that the IDF is doing everything possible to avoid harming those not involved. But on the 18th of November, he declared that, first of all, and above all else, Israel acts according to the laws of war. This is how our army works. The Minister of Defence publicly stated on the 29th of October that we are not fighting the Palestinian multitude and the Palestinian people in Gaza, and declared on the 13th of November that our war is against the Hamas terrorist organisation, not the people of Gaza. Again, the President of Israel declared on the 12th of October that we are operating militarily according to rules of international law, period, unequivocally. We have collated numerous such statements by the President, by the Prime Minister, by the Minister of Defence, by the IDF spokesperson and others in tab 2 of our volume. Since this is such a critical part of South Africa's thesis, permit me to refer to 2 further statements by the Prime Minister. I start with the most recent, 10th of January. Israel has no intention of permanently occupying Gaza or displacing its civilian population. Israel is fighting Hamas terrorists, not the Palestinian population, and we are doing so in full compliance with international law. The IDF is doing its utmost to minimise civilian casualties, while Hamas is doing its utmost to maximise them by using Palestinian civilians as human shields. The IDF urges Palestinian civilians to leave war zones by disseminating leaflets, making phone calls, providing safe passage corridors, while Hamas prevents Palestinians from leaving at gunpoint and often with gunfire. Our goal is to rid Gaza of Hamas terrorists and free our hostages. Once this is achieved, Gaza can be demilitarized and de-radicalized, thereby creating a possibility for a better future for Israel and Palestinians alike. On 23rd of November, Prime Minister Netanyahu declared that any civilian death is a tragedy, anyone. And to avoid them, what you do is first you try and get the civilian out of harm's way. And that's exactly what we did. There are many more of the same. Any careful review of the official and binding policy decisions made by the relevant authorities in Israel since the outbreak of the war clearly evidence that such decisions lack any genocidal intent.
Madam President, members of the court, it is an honor to appear before you on behalf of the State of Israel. As Professor Shaw noted, at this stage, South Africa does not need to prove that genocidal acts have been or are being committed. But it does have to show that the Genocide Convention is actually relevant. It has to show some level of acts and some level of intent. Professor Shaw has spoken to the issue of express intent. It is my task to speak to the circumstances of Israel's actions. Israel cannot possibly comprehensively address today all of the allegations made in South Africa's application in this regard. The applicant paints a dire picture, but it is a partial and deeply flawed picture. The application is so distorted in its descriptions that it prevents the court from properly assessing the plausibility of the rights asserted by South Africa. Plausibility cannot be determined based on the unsubstantiated allegations of one party to the proceedings alone, if Article 41 of the court statute is to have any meaning. In the time available, I will address three aspects of reality on the ground that the applicant has either ignored or misrepresented. First, Hamas's military tactics and strategy. Second, Israel's efforts to mitigate civilian harm during operational activity. And third, Israel's efforts to address humanitarian hardship in Gaza, despite Hamas's attempts at obstruction. With respect to Hamas's military tactics and strategy, it is astounding that in yesterday's hearing, Hamas was mentioned only in passing and only in reference to the October 7 massacre in Israel. Listening to the presentation by the applicant, it was as if Israel is operating in Gaza against no armed adversary, but the same Hamas that carried out the October 7 attacks in Israel is the governing authority in Gaza. And the same Hamas has built a military strategy founded on embedding its assets and operatives in and amongst the civilian population. Urban warfare will always result in tragic deaths, harm, and damage. But in Gaza, these undesired outcomes are exacerbated because they are the desired outcomes of Hamas. In urban warfare, civilian casualties may be the unintended but lawful result of attacks on lawfully military objectives. International humanitarian law recognizes this reality and provides a framework for balancing military necessity with humanitarian considerations. These do not constitute genocidal acts. In the current conflict, many civilian deaths are directly caused by Hamas. Booby-trapped homes detonate and kill indiscriminately. Mines in alleyways collapse structures around them. And over 2,000 rockets, misfired by Hamas, have landed inside Gaza, causing untold levels of harm. One telling example is a blast at the Al-Hali hospital on October 17. Hamas claimed that the Israel Defense Forces, the IDF, attacked the hospital. Headlines around the world rushed to repeat this claim. The IDF later proved, and U.S. intelligence and other national security intelligence agencies independently confirmed that the blast was the result of a failed launch from within Gaza. It was not, as Hamas claimed, the fault of the IDF. Damage to civilian structures is another fact claimed by South Africa as evidence of genocide. But South Africa does not consider the sheer extent to which Hamas uses ostensibly civilian structures for military purposes. Houses, schools, mosques, UN facilities, and shelters are all abused for military purposes by Hamas, including as rocket launching sites. Hundreds of kilometers of tunnels dug by Hamas under populated areas in Gaza often cause structures above to collapse. In the slides before you, you can see militant priming projectiles for launch on IDF forces in Gaza. You can see the holes in the residential house to hide and launch them. Here, you can see projectiles discovered underneath a bed in a child's bedroom. Here, a rocket being fired from a school. The launch site is circled in red. Here, you can see firing from a UN school. You can see the letters UN on the roof, and the fire is circled in red. And here, long-range rocket launchers hidden inside a Scouts Club building. Finally, you can see part of a tunnel that runs for 4 kilometers, including nearby the Erez crossing, which is adjacent to Israel. Gaza's infrastructure has certainly been harmed during the conflict. However, South Africa would have the court believe that Israel is deliberately and unlawfully destroying homes without cause. But harm caused to lawful military objectives and harm caused as a result of Hamas's actions is not evidence of genocide. South Africa also alleges that Israel has waged an assault on Gaza's health system. What South Africa has neglected to bring before the court, however, is the overwhelming evidence of Hamas's military use of such hospitals. Hamas militants retreated to Rantisi Hospital in Gaza on October 7th with hostages from Israel, whom they then held in the basement. In the slide before you, you will see a militant going into Quds Hospital with an RPG. Hamas fired at IDF forces from near and from within the Quds Hospital. At Shifa Hospital, Gaza's largest, Hamas managed operations from a closed-off area. Here you can see an opening to the tunnel that ran for hundreds of meters directly under the hospital. Here, you can see the weapons found in different wings of the hospital. And here, CCTV footage showing armed militants bringing hostages into the hospital's lobby. More than 80 militants hiding inside another hospital, the Adwan Hospital, surrendered themselves to the IDF. And here, you can see a weapon that IDF forces discovered hidden inside incubators at the hospital. The director of the hospital has admitted that numerous members of hospital staff belong to Hamas's military wing. In the Indonesian hospital in the neighborhood of Jabalia, Hamas forces managed their operations from that hospital until the IDF reached it. IDF forces recovered the bodies of 5 murdered hostages from a tunnel dug underneath the hospital. The list goes on. In every single hospital that the IDF has searched in Gaza, it has found evidence of Hamas military use. Israel is acutely aware that because of Hamas's use of hospitals as shields for its military operations, in grave violations of international humanitarian law, patients and staff are at risk. This is why the IDF has reached out to every hospital and offered assistance in relocating patients and staff to safer areas. Hospitals have not been bombed. Rather, the IDF sends soldiers to search and dismantle military infrastructure, reducing damage and disruption. Indeed, the tunnel that sat directly under the main building in Shifa Hospital was exploded without damaging the building above. The IDF then withdrew from the hospital. Yes, damage and harm have occurred as a result of hostilities in hospitals' vicinity, sometimes by IDF fire, sometimes by Hamas, but always as a direct result of Hamas's abhorrent method of warfare. Israel has published plenty of evidence of the extensive misuse by Hamas of medical facilities in direct violations of international humanitarian law. It has brought journalists to see firsthand. It has recorded calls with hospital staffs to coordinate assistance. None of that is mentioned in the application. In fact, the applicant describes the result and asks the court to attribute malicious intent to Israel. But that is only a possible conclusion if one obscures, as the applicant has, Hamas's strategy of turning hospitals into terrorist compounds. The applicant also made much of the fact that force has been even used in humanitarian zones. What the applicant neglected to inform the court, however, was that Hamas has, in its contempt for Palestinian civil life, regularly and deliberately fired from such zones, turning areas of relief into zones of conflict. Here before you, you can see one example of a launch site adjacent to the humanitarian zone, both amplified in larger pictures. And in the next slide, you can see evidence of a rocket launched from next to Gaza's water desalination facility. I now would like to address briefly the second issue, Israel's efforts at mitigation of civilian harm. Here, too, the applicant tells not just a partial story, but a false one. For example, the application presents Israel's call to civilians to evacuate areas of intensive hostilities, quote, as an act calculated to bring about its physical destruction, quote. This is a particularly egregious allegation that is completely disconnected from the governing legal framework of international humanitarian law. Evacuation of civilians is recognized under international humanitarian law as one of the measures that may be implemented to protect civilians from the effects of ongoing hostilities. Indeed, such evacuation may even amount to a duty that the party to the conflict has towards civilians. While temporary evacuation undoubtedly involves hardship and suffering, it is preferable to remaining in areas of intensive hostilities, all the more so when one party makes a concerted effort to use those civilians as shields. The IDF maintains a civilian harm mitigation unit to undertake this task. It works full-time to provide advance notice of areas in which the IDF intends to intensify its activities, coordinate travel routes for civilians, and secure these routes. This unit has developed a detailed map so that specific areas can be temporarily evacuated instead of evacuating entire areas. On the slide before you, you can see that map divided into areas, as well as a screenshot of a video explaining the system in Arabic so civilians may understand it. The IDF also enacts localized pauses in its operations to allow civilians to move. It does this even though Hamas does not agree to do the same, and has even attacked IDF forces securing humanitarian corridors.
Excuse me, I have a request from the interpreters that you slow down the pace of your speaking. Could you please do that? Thank you.
Yesterday, South Africa stated that the IDF gave 24 hours notice to civilians in northern Gaza to evacuate. In fact, the IDF urged civilians to evacuate to southern Gaza for over 3 weeks before it started its ground operation. 3 weeks that provided Hamas with advanced knowledge of where and when the IDF would be operating. This 3-week period for temporary evacuation is a matter of common knowledge, and the applicant's misrepresentation of this fact is at best an unfamiliarity with the events, and at worst, a desire to tailor its story to a pre-existing narrative. The IDF employs a range of additional measures in accordance with the obligation to take precautionary measures under international humanitarian law. For example, it provides effective advance warnings of attacks where circumstances permit. To date, the IDF has dropped millions of leaflets over areas of expected attacks with instructions to evacuate and how to do so, broadcast countless messages over radio and through social media, warning civilians to distance themselves from Hamas operations, and made over 70,000 individual phone calls, including to occupants of the targets, warning them of impending attacks. This requires time, it requires resources and intelligence, and the IDF invests all of these to save civilian lives. Here you can see the IDF's Arabic Twitter account, providing information for civilians to evacuate specific areas, including the location of shelters nearby. Yet the applicant, astonishingly, claims that these efforts are in themselves genocidal. In other words, a measure intended to mitigate harm to the civilian population, sometimes exceeding the requirements of international humanitarian law, is proof, according to the applicant, of Israel's intent to commit genocide, when in fact it proves the exact opposite. My third topic, with respect to the humanitarian situation. Much attention was given by South Africa to this situation. Despite Israel's efforts to mitigate harm, there is no question that many civilians in Gaza are suffering as a result of the war that Hamas began. While Israel is seeking to minimize civilian harm, Hamas is doing everything in its power to use the civilian population and civilian infrastructure for its own protection, thwarting humanitarian efforts aimed at alleviating the distress of the civilian population. Further illustration on Hamas's tactics and Israel's efforts can be found in tabs 4 and 9 of the volume provided to the court. I now turn to describe just some of the humanitarian coordination efforts that Israel has been engaged in, and Mr. Sender will further expand on this. Israel maintains a dedicated military unit called Kogat, responsible for routine coordination with international organizations in Gaza with respect to various humanitarian aspects. It is Kogat that mans and operates the crossings between Israel and Gaza. This includes the Erez crossing, through which prior to October 7, almost 20,000 Gazans passed through into Israel daily for work. South Africa showed a map yesterday, with the Erez crossing marked closed. What it failed to note is that the crossing was attacked on October 7th by Hamas, which murdered and kidnapped Kogat staff and caused significant damage. Here you can see some of that damage. Nevertheless, Kogat works around the clock to fulfill its role. Its large professional staff run numerous initiatives, of which I will only mention a few. First, Kogat manages a mechanism by which it maintains an up-to-date picture of the needs in Gaza. It does this with the UN, other international organizations, and states, whose representatives sit in Kogat's offices. Kogat uses this monitoring to help donor states and organizations prioritize their aid efforts to fit the evolving situation on the ground. Second, Kogat facilitates the entry of aid into Gaza. Israel has publicly stated repeatedly that there is no limit on the amount of food, water, shelter, or medical supplies that can be brought into Gaza. To increase capacity, Kogat has reopened the Kerem Shalom crossing, as acknowledged by the Security Council in Resolution 2720, despite Hamas putting it under fire. Israel has offered to extend operating hours at the crossing if there is a capacity to receive the goods by international organizations on the Gazan side. Third, Kogat works to reinforce and strengthen medical services. COGAT has facilitated the huge logistical challenge of establishing 4 field hospitals in Gaza, and more are being set up, and 2 floating hospitals. It has facilitated the entry of new ambulances into Gaza, and Israel has even coordinated airdrops of aid over Gaza by Jordan, coordinating these flights with the Israel Air Force operating in Gaza. This, of course, is not to say that nothing more can be done, or that there are no challenges to the humanitarian situation in Gaza. Such challenges exist and change according to the evolving circumstances of the conflict. But it is to say that the charge of genocide in the face of these extensive efforts is frankly untenable. It is an inconvenient truth for the applicant's case, but one of the most significant challenges is the fact that Hamas commandeers consignments into Gaza and controls their distribution. Gazan residents have reported that Hamas is regularly stealing aid at the expense of its own population for the benefit of its fighters. This is a tweet stating that fuel and medical equipment was stolen by purported Hamas members from an UNRWA warehouse. UNRWA later deleted the tweet, perhaps under pressure from the authorities. Here you can see Hamas commandeering an aid truck. And here is another example. Because Hamas for years has used aid consignments to smuggle weapons, security checks of all goods going into Gaza are required, as acknowledged by international humanitarian law. Hamas has time and again hoarded fuel, including during the current conflict, which it uses for military purposes to sustain ventilation in its expansive underground tunnel network and for its continued attacks against Israel. Nevertheless, in coordination with the UN, Israel enables fuel to enter Gaza to service essential infrastructure, such as sewage treatment, desalination plants, water pumps and hospitals, and cellular infrastructure for maintaining communication. Israel remains committed to helping international organizations and states involved in the aid effort to overcome these hurdles and consistently increase the amount of aid and services available to the population in Gaza, as will be further described by Mr. Sender. Here, a picture of incubators that the IDF provided to Shifa Hospital. Here, a picture of an ambulance convoy coordinated by COGAT. A picture of consignments. A picture of ambulances, the entry of which was coordinated by COGAT. And finally, more consignments waiting to enter Gaza. Madam President, members of the court, in the time allotted, I have been able to describe only some of Israel's efforts to mitigate civilian harm and to address the humanitarian situation in Gaza. But even this mere fraction is enough to demonstrate how tendentious and partial the applicant's presentations of these facts is, and certainly enough to conclude that the allegation of intent to commit genocide is baseless. If Israel had such intent, would it delay a ground maneuver for weeks, urging civilians to seek safer space, and in doing so, sacrificing operational advantage? Would it invest massive resources to provide civilians details about where to go, when to go, how to leave areas of fighting? Would it maintain a dedicated unit staffed with experts whose sole role is to facilitate aid and who continue to do so despite having their staff killed and kidnapped? When a population is ruled by a terrorist organization that cares more about wiping out its neighbor than about protecting its own civilians, there are acute challenges in protecting the civilian population. Those challenges are exacerbated by the dynamic and evolving nature of intense hostilities in an urban area, where the enemy exploits hospitals, shelters, and critical infrastructure. Would Israel work continuously with international organizations and states, even reaching out to them on its own initiative, to find solutions to these challenges if it were seeking to destroy the population? Israel's efforts to mitigate the ravages of this war on civilians are the very opposite of intent to destroy them. Under these circumstances, far from being the only inference that could reasonably be drawn from Israel's pattern of conduct, intent to commit genocide is not even a plausible inference. Madam President, members of the court, that concludes my statement. I thank you for your kind attention, and I ask that you now invite Mr. Sender to the podium.
Madam President, members of the court, it is an honor to appear before you today on behalf of the State of Israel. It falls to me to address the condition of risk of irreparable harm and urgency. Civilians have been severely affected by the hostilities instigated by Hamas. Its systematic strategy of prosecuting war from under and within the civilian population exposes civilians to great risk, and it has brought about great suffering. Israel has done and is doing a great deal to alleviate this suffering in very challenging circumstances. In this regard, the factual account provided by the applicant is once again entirely one-sided. The application and request run no less than 84 pages, but they make hardly any mention of the extraordinary efforts undertaken by Israel and by a host of other states and international actors to improve the humanitarian situation. We again heard virtually nothing from the applicant on this issue yesterday. But this is a critical factor in the request before you. As Ms. Radwan has shown, it frustrates any attempt to establish the necessary special intent for genocide. It also bears upon the third condition established in your case law. Precisely such concrete measures have been taken by Israel, which has been facilitating the provision of more and more humanitarian assistance for people in need throughout the Gaza Strip. These steps have not only been increasing so as to meet the developing situation on the ground. They are continuously undertaken specifically in order to prevent harm to the civilian population. These efforts have had an impact. Just last week, for example, with the assistance of the World Food Programme, a dozen bakeries reopened with a capacity to produce more than 2 million breads a day. The World Food Programme has said the delivery of flour, salt, sugar, and yeast continues so as to enable more bakeries to reopen, increasing accessibility and affordability for thousands of families. And since the applicant mentioned yesterday the number of trucks entering Gaza each day before and after the war, the accurate average number for trucks specifically carrying food is 70 trucks a day before the war and 109 trucks a day over the last 2 weeks. All this information may be found in your judge's folder. Access to water has also been a priority. As with food supplies, there is no restriction on the amount of water that may enter Gaza. Israel continues to supply its own water to Gaza by 2 pipelines. It facilitates the delivery of bottled water in large quantities, and it repairs and indeed expands water infrastructure that has been damaged by the fighting. An additional water pipe, bringing water into southern Gaza from Egypt, began operating a few weeks ago. Access to medical supplies and services is also growing. Israel has so far facilitated the establishment of 4 field hospitals and 2 floating hospitals. The establishment of 2 more hospitals is underway. Israel is facilitating the entry of medical teams into Gaza, as also vaccinations, including in cooperation with UNICEF. Ill and wounded persons are being evacuated through the Rafah border crossing to Egypt, the United Arab Emirates, Turkey, Qatar, and Jordan. Tents and winter equipment are being distributed as well. The constant delivery of fuel and cooking gas is also facilitated. According to official data, again in your judges' folders, from 8 December, the amount of fuel entering Gaza has doubled and currently stands at 180,000 liters a day. This is a target amount requested by the UN itself. Since 21 December, the amount of cooking gas entering Gaza has also doubled, now standing at an average of 90 tons per day. Details of this kind concerning the various ongoing humanitarian efforts are updated every single day on a designated English website of COGAT, the unit in the Ministry of Defense in charge of monitoring the humanitarian situation. When pressing needs are identified, solutions are soon coordinated. A great effort is indeed invested in eliminating bottlenecks so as to improve the entrance and distribution of aid, notwithstanding Hamas constantly stealing it. As you have heard, a joint operations room involving Israel, Egypt, the United States, and the UN operates daily to solve in real time logistical difficulties. Israel also coordinates with various UN agencies and the ICRC to address their own needs. On 15 December, Israel decided to open its crossing at Kerem Shalom with the express intention to improve and upgrade the delivery of humanitarian assistance to Palestinian civilians in Gaza. That part of the government's decision is in your judges' folder as well. This has eased congestion at the Rafah crossing and helped facilitate the provision of greater amounts of aid. Israel facilitates air routes as well for parachuting aid directly into Gaza. Facilitating a maritime corridor is currently being considered with other states. Madam President, members of the court, again, these are just some examples. But they show that Israel, no doubt, meets the legal test of concrete measures aimed specifically at recognizing and ensuring the rights of the Palestinian civilians in Gaza to exist.
Madam President, members of the court, a second general matter we alluded to is the broader implications of this application for Israel and the wider international community. As we have shown, this case concerns a large-scale armed conflict with tragic consequences for civilians on both sides. Yes, there is a heart-wrenching armed conflict, but the attempt to classify it as genocide and trigger provisional measures is not just unfounded in law. It has far-reaching and negative implications that extend well beyond the case before you. Ultimately, entertaining the applicant's request will not strengthen the commitment to prevent and punish genocide, but weaken it. It will turn an instrument adopted by the international community to prevent horrors of the kind that shocked the conscience of humanity during the Holocaust into a weapon in the hands of terrorist groups who have no regard for humanity or for the law. If every resort to force in self-defense against an enemy hiding behind civilians can be portrayed as genocide and trigger provisional measures, an inevitable tension will be created between the Genocide Convention and states defending themselves against the ever-increasing capacities of terrorist organizations. Doing so would also signal to terrorist organizations that they can commit war crimes and crimes against humanity and then exploit this court to obtain protection. For us, provisional measures would lead to a perverse situation. It would effectively allow Hamas to continue attacking the citizens of Israel, to hold 136 hostages in unbearable conditions, to keep tens of thousands of displaced Israelis from returning to their homes, and essentially to promote its plan to massacre as many Israelis and Jews as it can. Madam President, members of the court, in living memory of the atrocities that gave birth to the term genocide, in the aftermath of which the State of Israel was founded, we are witness to a concerted and cynical effort to pervert the meaning of the term genocide itself. The Genocide Convention is too important a foundation in humanity's aspiration to defeat barbarism and evil to be belittled in this way. And the faith that has been placed in international law and its institutions is too cherished an asset to be squandered. We appeal to this court not to be taken down that dangerous road.
I thank the co-agent of Israel, whose statement brings to an end the single round of oral argument of Israel, as well as the present series of sitting. In accordance with the usual practice, I shall request the agents of both parties to remain at the court's disposal to provide any additional information the court may require. The court will render its order on the request for the indication of provisional measures submitted by South Africa as soon as possible. The agents of the parties will be advised in due course as to the date on which the court will deliver the order in public sitting. Since the court has no other business before it today, the sitting is declared closed.
Before we get going here, guys, I got to tell you about cbdistillery.com. I am someone who doesn't sleep well. And I also, I do this show, I end it late, I'm kind of high strung at the end of it. And so I need to relax and calm down. And that is why I looked into cbdistillery.com for a natural way to relax and get some sleep. CB Distillery has over 2 million satisfied customers. 90% report they sleep better with CBD. 81% says CBD helps them with stress. 80% says CBD helps with aches and pains after physical activity. So if you struggle to get a good night's sleep, or if you're just like a high-strung, high-stress person like yours truly, you just need a little calm in your life, or if you suffer from pain and discomfort after physical activity, try CBD from the source that I trust, cbdistillery.com. You'll get 20% off your order when you enter my name, Kim, at checkout. No prescription required. That's cbdistillery.com, promo code Kim for 20% off.